Wise Child by Monica Furlong. Chapter 4. Fairy Food. I was to see Coleman again quite soon. On Saturday, Juniper said, "Mass tomorrow," as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "I thought we'd go down with Tilly, and then I'll wait till it's over and bring you back," she said, "this first time at least." "I shall have to fast tomorrow morning," I said shyly, not sure how well she understood our customs. "Of course," she said. "I thought I could bring some bread down, and you can have a bite on the way home, or a picnic if you'd rather." I was not sure whether Phil Priest was glad to see me or not. He greeted me shortly as I entered, and walked me down the aisle with his hand on my shoulder. I was glad to get out from under its weight and scramble over the legs of Connor and Seamus to reach Coleman's side. When Phil gave his exposition of the gospel, he talked about the powers of darkness and how they must be overcome by the powers of light. Coleman, who always listened in church, instead of daydreaming as I did, nudged me gently with his elbow. As if guessing that Phil might have spoken against her, Juniper asked me about him when I rejoined her. We were walking through a little wood, along the banks of the river, and I was already munching my bread. "He talked about Pelagius," I lied. Pelagius was an English scholar who had had a quarrel with the great St. Augustine, and Phil was always defending him or else telling us about the other big quarrel about the date of Easter. "Pelagius, he who thinks we are good entirely by our own endeavors?" Juniper asked. "The man's a fool." "Phil doesn't think so." Truly, I did not care one way or another, but I was surprised that Juniper knew about Pelagius. Although Juniper was not a Christian, from then on Sundays became our holy days, and apart from caring for the animals, we did no work. I had soon learned to milk Daisy, and though she never yielded as much milk for me as for Juniper, it was one of my favorite chores. Still, I resented having to get up early to do it. On Sundays we would go down to the shore, where Juniper soon taught me to swim, or we would walk in the great meadow, or if it was wet, we would light a fire and sit by it, and Juniper would tell me her marvelous stories or sing to me. We needed our Sundays, since we worked so hard the rest of the week. "Pearl shall wake you," Juniper had said a day or two after I had settled in, and every morning the white cat would push the door of the big bedroom open. Juniper had got up long since. Jump on my bed and walk patiently over me until I sat up. "Go away, Pearl," I would say crossly, but she was persistent and would give me no peace until I got out of bed, ran downstairs, and washed myself in the trough under the cistern in the yard. As I ran in again, shivering and bad-tempered, I could hear Juniper busy in the dairy. I dressed, came downstairs again, and went out to milk Daisy, and by the time I had finished, breakfast was always ready. Then I did some horrible heathen English, or worked at astronomy with some of the glass stones on the floor. That was the easy part. The real labors of the day began in the afternoon. The worst afternoon was one we spent cutting peat, during a period of a waning moon, of course. It was a wet day, when I thought we should have stayed at home by the fire, and the walk to the bog seemed endless. Then I had the job of pulling back the heather roots, which were tough and hurt my hands, to expose the peat underneath. Juniper cut the long, thin pieces of turf with a sharp spade. You push it in at an angle, and then it all had to be piled up in neat heaps to dry. It was boring, back-aching work, and it took all afternoon before Juniper was satisfied. On another day we would load it all into Tilly's panniers and take it back to the White House, where it would all have to be piled up again. "Won't that be lovely in the winter?" was Juniper's only comment on our work. Another afternoon, nearly as dreadful, we spent collecting sphagnum moss, sundew, and bog myrtle, the first two for whooping cough, which often killed babies in our village, the last to make our winter beer. The sphagnum grew over the wettest places in the bog. Once the water and muck came right over the top of my boots and soaked my stockings, and at once, trying to save myself from a ducking, I plunged both my hands into the mud. It was very cold. The afternoon was drawing in, and I shivered on the long walk home. In spite of my coldness and bad temper, Juniper made me measure the volume of the myrtle in a tub, take the same amount of water, boil half of it and add honey to it, pour it over the leaves, and then add the rest of the water. When it had cooled, I had to add yeast to make it froth. A month later, we drank it with our meals, and it tasted good. In the meantime, however, I was very cross that Juniper would not let me wash or change my clothes until I had completed the whole task, though she did have a splendid fire going by the time I had finished. There were many days when we walked in search of a root or a leaf, some seeds or a flower, which Juniper needed for some recipe of hers. Other days we hoed and weeded and plucked at home, sometimes laying the herbs out in the sun to dry, sometimes carefully layering them indoors. I was puzzled that, despite my unwillingness, I still helped. Partly it was because Juniper worked so hard herself. Partly it was that in other ways she was so kind to me, and partly it was that she simply took it for granted that I would. Plants bore me, stinking things. What's this one? Cow parsley. God help us, you'll poison us all yet. It's hemlock, and you can recognize it by its height, by its purple spots, and by the horrid smell it has when it's bruised. Here, smell. Ugh! Juniper never scolded me, but she did not reduce either lessons or work. Day after day she repeated names of plants to me, showed me leaves and petals, roots, sap, and seed, made me taste and smell and feel, and day after day she set me, anything but willing, to stir some gruesome-looking green or black mess bubbling in a saucepan over the fire. Hot and almost swooning from the odors, I stirred until my arms felt as if they would drop off. "Puts me off my dinner," I would grumble, and I would take my food out to eat on the steps. I hated all the fiddly little processes, the stripping of leaves, the chopping, the crunching of stems. I preferred the milking and the butter and cheese making, though my arm used to ache from pumping the handle of the churn. Within a few weeks, though, I noticed that my arms had gotten much stronger, with all the turning and lifting and carrying Juniper required of her assistant. It was fun to eat the pat of butter or the tiny cheese I had shaped for myself. "It tastes so much better when you do it yourself," Juniper said. When we were not busy in the dairy, we were making preserves for the winter, or mashing crab apples to make a spicy drink, or washing our clothes or ourselves. Juniper, unlike my grandmother, was terribly fussy about being clean. She washed me all over once a week out in the yard. It made me scream, the water was so cold. And then she washed my hair with a lotion of rosemary. I could hardly believe it the first time she dried it for me and combed it out. It was black and glistening in the mirror. "You have lovely hair, wise child," she said. and I was really surprised. I did not know that anything about me was lovely. My mother, who was beautiful, had once wondered in my hearing how a woman like her could have a child who looked like me. I would often study again for an hour or two before supper time. And by the time I had found the eggs and laid the table and washed the dishes afterward, I was often half asleep in my little green chair. Yet that was often the best part of the day, with Juniper spinning and singing and telling me fairy tales. She had taught me 1 or 2 songs and sometimes made me sing them to her. Coleman came again before the week was out, bringing an eel he had caught. He was too little to be as good a fisherman as his brothers. He rarely caught a proper fish, and if he had, they would have eaten it at home. But he was good at catching eels. Juniper received him with her usual courtesy, gave him a big doorstep of bread and jam to eat, and told him she hoped he would come again often, as I needed another child to play with. I soon discovered that she would let me off my chores when Coleman came. "Is she still good to you?" he asked when we were alone. "Of course, though the herbs are awfully boring. No worse than school, though. Your hair looks nice. Juniper washed it for me. She says it will be lovely when it grows a bit. You don't look so thin, either." "I know." I had noticed that my face had filled out a little and looked both pinker and browner. "Have you found out anything about the cave yet?" "Not yet." There was one mystery that I was not ready to tell Coleman about. I thought it might be unlucky. Every night when we had finished milking, we left out a cheese wrapped in rushes, or a bit of butter, or some cream and eggs, at the foot of the meadow stile. Occasionally we left a loaf of bread or a tiny jar with jam in it. "I didn't know fairies ate bread," I said casually as I helped Juniper lay out the nightly feast. "Well, you don't know everything," she answered politely. In the morning there was no sign of the food, though if we had left a bowl or pitcher it was returned, washed, the next day. "I'd like to see them take it," I said to Juniper. "Some feasts are better secret," she replied. She had other secrets about, then. One was that at night, when I was in bed, she mounted to her attic room with the ivory handle, and began to sing a gentle rhythmic song, always the same one. "May I see what you do in the attic?" I asked her. "One day, when you are ready." Quite often she went to the village to see people who were sick, leaving me with poetry to learn or chores to do. A timid child would come up with a message. "Mum's terrible sick, and Dad said, would you come? Kirsty's fell off the house and broken all her bones." They tended to the dramatic in their descriptions of catastrophe. Juniper would find out as much as she could about what ailed the sick person, collect up some of her jars and leaves and potions, and tie them onto Tilly's saddle, and would be gone, sometimes for hours. She was tired when she returned, and I would wait upon her, and eventually creep up and lean my head against her. Eileen had the fever and was vomiting. What would you have done, wise child? I would shudder and try to change the subject. I particularly hated it when she would tell me of some horrible accident. A scythe across a man's leg, a hook in his eye, a baby that had eaten poison, and I would cover my ears until she stopped talking about it. "Pain and sickness don't go away because you don't like to listen," she would say. "It's horrible." "Not as horrible as your imagination." I remember one day when I had watched Juniper and Tilly disappear toward the village among the summer grasses until I could just see the top of Juniper's straw hat. and then I could not even see that anymore. I returned to the yard, feeling a little lonely, but was cheered by the bright sunlight, the clucking of the hens as they scratched around me, the shining rope of water that fell into the pails. Juniper had said that, as a treat, I might look at one of the big books of astronomy. She was impressed by my knowledge of the constellations, but knew that I wanted to learn more about their movements. I could only just carry the book she had indicated, with its heavy calf binding. I laid it flat on the table and went to open the clasp. The clasp was set with tiny jewels in red and green, and was in the form of a hand with a sleeve or cloak lying across it. I was enchanted by the beauty of the workmanship on such a tiny, unimportant piece of work as the clasp of a book, too. Suddenly it was as if I was there in the room where the craftsman had made the clasp, or he was here with me. It was the oddest feeling, as if time or place might just be an illusion. "He is making it now," I heard myself say out loud. I opened the clasp and pushed back the heavy sheets of vellum. Here too was beauty, pictures of the sky by men who had spent whole nights searching it. Like Finbar. I grieved for Finbar at that moment, my head upon my hand. "Father, come back to me," I said. I could see his wide gaze quite clearly, the gaze of someone who had just heard an unexpected sound. Then his face faded. When I had finished my astronomy, I turned unwillingly to the herb beds. "I thought if you were educated, you didn't have to do boring things," I had said to Juniper the day before. "There are people who think like that," Juniper had said. "Such a pity. Boredom is so valuable." I could not imagine what she meant. Perhaps because of the clasp and the vision of Finbar, things were different this morning. The plants, which had caused me so much work and trouble, seemed vividly alive in the sunlight. The faces of the marigolds shone with a kind of innocence. I worked steadily among the rows until I got to the back of the garden. The sight of the nightshade and the other sinister plants brought the thought of witchcraft to mind. I was suddenly tempted by the little ivory handle on the attic door. I could go up the stairs and Juniper would never know I had been. Yet suppose I found some of the horrible things witches were said to use in spells. Bowls of blood, knives, mutilated animals, skeletons. What should I do then? If Juniper was wicked, she didn't show it to me, and I didn't want her to show it. Toward twilight, I went for a little walk across the meadow. As I passed the stile, I remembered that I had not yet put out the fairy food, as Juniper had instructed me. Juniper usually put it out before dark, directly after milking. But surely the fairies did not come until nightfall. I would remember. I walked in the gloaming along the path Juniper had trodden with her donkey, quietly admiring the great red poppies glowing like fires in the grass. Suddenly I stiffened. There, coming along the path toward me, was Cormac. The horrible Cormac. He had not seen me, clearly was not expecting to see anyone. Even in the half-light I could see his frighteningly swollen and mutilated face, the sores and the swellings, and the appalling eyes surrounded by pus. Cormac had lived in my nightmares, as in the nightmares of other children in the village. I had particularly hated the thought at Mass that even as we were going to the altar to receive the body of Christ, that hideous squinting face was spying on us through a window in the church wall. Like all the children, I threw stones at him if I saw him approaching. I did so now. I picked up a rock and hurled it in his direction. It hit him quite hard on the shoulder, and he gave one yell of total surprise before his eyes fell on me. At once, like a wild animal who has seen a human, he turned and ran. I shuddered with relief. I went back to the house, finished my chores, left the food out for the fairies, and went to bed. By the time Pearl woke me the next morning, I could already hear Juniper singing in the dairy.